At the dinner party with his friends, my husband humiliated me. "You parasite, you must pay the $4,000 bill," he said. That sentence still echoes in my head, sharper than any glass breaking against the floor. I remember the chandeliers above gleaming like stars I wanted to reach, but my hands trembled under the weight of everyone's eyes. I had expected laughter, polite conversations, the subtle clink of silverware on fine china, maybe even a few smiles from people who thought they were sophisticated, but instead I got humiliation served cold, with a side of arrogance I hadn't signed up for. I'm Emily, born in 1989 in Atlanta. Back in my 20s, I had this foolish idea that marriage meant partnership, trust, and shared laughter over burnt pancakes at 2 in the morning. Daniel had promised the same, or at least he whispered it often enough for me to believe him. But that night, at 34, wearing a navy cocktail dress I'd spent hours picking out, I felt like a shadow in the very light I'd wanted to bask in. The moment he threw that $4,000 bill onto my lap, I felt it was not just the weight of the check, but the crushing realization that he had always planned to humiliate me. The restaurant had gone silent for a heartbeat after his words, a pause thick enough to taste in the air. I could feel the heat in my ears, the tightness in my chest, the sudden squeeze in my stomach, as if someone had just squeezed the life out of my confidence. What are you doing?" I stammered, looking around at the crowd of his colleagues. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to notice. Others they smirked, enjoying a private joke at my expense. I could see the expensive silverware, the crystal glasses catching the candlelight, everything meant to show off their wealth, but it all felt meaningless now, a backdrop to my public shaming. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a smug grin plastered across his face, as if the power dynamic was a game he always intended to win. I felt a cold fire ignite inside me. It was fear, yes, but also a spark of something sharper: determination. I told myself, quietly, "You won't break me here, not tonight." Around me, snippets of conversation floated like smoke. "She really doesn't belong in this world, does she?" "I'd never let my wife get away with that." His friends were murmuring judgments, their voices sliding through the air like knives. I felt the sting but kept my composure, my fingers tightening around the edge of my napkin. I reminded myself, dignity isn't taken, it's claimed, and if he thought he could make me crumble, he was gravely underestimating me. When Daniel waved a hand toward the server and barked, "Take it, she can pay," my heart skipped, but I didn't cry. Not yet. I forced a polite smile, one that concealed everything roiling beneath. I caught the waiter's eye, offering a nod that said, "I'll handle this," while my mind raced through every possible escape. Every family story of resilience flashed through me. My mother standing up to my grandfather when he belittled her for her ambitions. Aunt Mabel trying to bake cookies at midnight and laughing at the disaster. My cousins supporting one another through the small embarrassments that made us stronger. They were my anchors, reminding me, "You've got this." I had to breathe, in and out. I imagined the scene as a story, a scene I could control if only I kept my head. I met Daniel's gaze and held it for just a second longer than he expected. He squirmed slightly, like the predator noticing the prey isn't afraid. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the arrogance, the assumption that I would fold, that I would pull out my wallet and pay quietly, that the embarrassment would crush me into submission. But it didn't. I felt my pulse in my throat as I watched the room, measuring reactions, noting expressions. One colleague shifted uneasily in his seat, frowning. Another whispered to a companion, their eyes darting toward Daniel with a glance that spoke more than words could. I realized that even in this room full of wealth and power, his hold wasn't absolute. I wasn't alone in noticing his cruelty. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, soft even, though underneath it ran steel. "Daniel," I said, leaning slightly forward, "I think we should talk about this privately." The words were simple, almost too polite for the storm in my chest. But the hint of firmness made a few heads turn, a few more caught on that perhaps there was more beneath the surface than the show Daniel was putting on. He laughed, a sharp, calculated sound, tilting his glass toward me as if to mock my poise. "Oh, Emily, always so serious. Don't worry about it, just pay what you owe." And in that moment I felt a strange clarity. The humiliation, the anger, the fear, it was all fuel. I could see the evening clearly now. Daniel wanted an audience. He wanted them to see me small, to see him powerful. But if I could turn the narrative even slightly, he wouldn't get the satisfaction. Not tonight. I took a breath, slowly reminding myself that elegance wasn't just the dress or the chandeliers, it was how you carry yourself under pressure. I smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, at a waiter passing by, a silent acknowledgement that I was not defeated. I thought about every late night I had spent studying, building skills, learning independence, quietly preparing for moments just like this. This wasn't over. Far from it. I adjusted the strap of my dress, letting the fabric shift naturally, masking the tension in my muscles. Daniel was unaware that the $4,000 bill he tossed like a weapon would not define me. That night, in front of everyone he wanted to impress, I felt the seeds of something bigger, a plan forming quietly, a patience that would serve as my armor. The room resumed its hum, faint whispers and the clink of glasses, but I no longer felt trapped in a spotlight of shame. I was aware, acutely aware of every detail, the expensive silverware, the hushed commentary, Daniel's self-satisfied smirk, and I stored them all mentally, cataloging them like evidence for a story that was not yet finished. My heart still ached with the sting of betrayal, but it was tempered by a simmering determination. As the dessert plates were brought in, and the waiters moved with polished precision, I continued to sit upright, composed, letting the moment stretch. I told myself, it's okay to feel embarrassed, it's okay to feel angry, but it's also okay to wait, to plan and to act with precision. That mantra repeated silently in my head as I listened to Daniel speak, oblivious to the fact that the narrative he tried to control was slipping through his fingers. By the end of the evening, I had memorized the pattern of the room, the laughter, the whispered judgments, and the subtle alliances forming in glances. I realized that this night, which had begun as a scene of humiliation, was shaping into the first act of my own story, one where dignity, patience, and quiet cunning would become my weapons. And as Daniel toasted his friends, basking in what he thought was triumph, I made a silent promise: this story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Long before that night of humiliation, long before the $4,000 bill landed in my lap like a weapon, I had begun noticing things about Daniel that didn't add up. It started subtly, with numbers that didn't match, receipts that seemed misplaced, and whispers from colleagues he assumed I wouldn't notice. At first I brushed them off, thinking maybe I was imagining things. That paranoia was creeping in after years of trying to please him, but a persistent knot in my stomach told me otherwise. Something was off, and I needed to understand it fully before I could act. I began paying attention in ways that felt almost like detective work. Every casual mention of expenses, every boast about impressing his friends, I cataloged in my mind. I would sit in our small office corner at home, laptop open, fingers hovering over spreadsheets, checking transactions and cross-referencing invoices. Daniel's company was not small, and the money flowing through it was significant. I realized that the very dinners and events he loved to flaunt were funded by funds he didn't legally control. He siphoned company money to appear grander than he truly was. The revelation made my blood run cold at first, but it also ignited a slow-burning determination. I remember one night, sipping chamomile tea to calm my nerves, staring at a bank transfer that made my eyes widen. The amount was significant, almost obscene. It was the same money that could have been used to pay real bills, to improve the business legitimately. Instead, it padded Daniel's image in front of his colleagues. He was a master at charm, at appearing competent, at hiding behind laughter and clever words, but I had found his weak spot, the truth. And truth, as I had learned, carried power if wielded carefully. I began my plan with meticulous precision. I downloaded files, printed copies, and saved emails that proved the siphoning. I kept the evidence hidden in a secure folder on my laptop, encrypted so that only I could access it. At night, when Daniel returned from his social escapades or networking dinners, I would sit quietly in our living room, replaying the events in my head. Every smug smile, every boastful remark he made, I stored like pieces of a puzzle, assembling a full picture of his deceit. It wasn't just about catching him in the act. It was about understanding him, predicting him. I observed how he reacted under pressure, how he tried to control conversations, and how easily he underestimated me. He thought I was oblivious, that my calm demeanor meant I was content, passive even. But each insult he hurled at my insecurities, each subtle dig fueled my resolve. I had felt the sting, yes, but I had also recognized the weakness behind it. He relied on appearances, on perception, and I was about to use that against him. I practiced what I would say, not aloud, but in my mind over and over. The delivery mattered too emotionally, and I would seem irrational, too cold, and it might not have an impact. I wanted to be calm, precision, a reveal that would leave no room for denial, no space for smirks. I imagined the dinner party, the clinking glasses, the flicker of candlelight, and I pictured the exact moment I would reveal the evidence. Every detail, from his smug grin to the polished laughter of his friends, I rehearsed silently until it felt like I had lived through the scene 100 times already. In those months, my internal transformation was profound. I no longer allowed his offhand criticisms to define me. I stopped seeking approval in ways that left me vulnerable. I reminded myself constantly, you are capable, you are not a parasite, you are worthy of respect. This mantra became my shield. I developed patience that felt like steel, calmness that felt like glass, transparent yet unbreakable. During this time, I also gathered small intelligence, casually asking mutual friends about Daniel's professional behavior, noting inconsistencies in stories he told. I learned how deeply he valued his public image, how desperately he needed validation from those around him, how vulnerable he was to exposure in front of peers. All of this information became ammunition, stored carefully alongside financial records and email trails. I also planned the night of the reveal with attention to optics. The dinner had to be his arena, the perfect backdrop for the unraveling of his carefully constructed image. I envisioned him leaning back, satisfied, confident, unaware that the tables were about to turn.
Every choice I made, my attire, my words, the timing was calculated to ensure maximum effect without a hint of rashness, and there were moments when doubt crept in. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, questioning if I could really follow through. The fear of confrontation, the terror of making the scene, the risk of failure, these thoughts were persistent, but I reminded myself why I was doing it. This was about justice, not revenge for the sake of cruelty. This was about reclaiming my dignity, showing the truth, and proving to myself that I could stand unbroken in the face of betrayal. The quiet planning became almost meditative. I would take walks, thinking through logistics, visualizing Daniel's expressions, imagining the subtle gasps of recognition when his friends understood the depth of his deception. I imagined the moment I would smile faintly, almost innocently, and then let the evidence speak louder than my voice. This mental rehearsal gave me a serenity I hadn't felt in years, a confidence that the moment of reckoning would come and I would be ready. I also considered the emotional impact on the room. I knew the audience mattered. Daniel thrived on admiration. The revelation needed witnesses, people whose reactions could amplify the consequences of his actions. I pictured the gasps, the whispered questions, the glances darting between him and me, the moment when he realized he was no longer in control. I wanted the shift in perception to be undeniable. In the weeks leading up to the dinner, I double-checked every piece of evidence, every email, every financial statement. I ensured nothing could be dismissed as coincidental, nothing could be undermined by doubt. I became a quiet storm, preparing with patience and meticulous care for the moment I would reclaim the narrative. Each night, I reminded myself, you've got this. It's okay to feel fear. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it. By the time the evening arrived, I was ready, calm, composed, and armed with the truth. I walked into the lion's den with the confidence that only preparation can bring. Daniel had expected a trophy wife, compliant and awed by his showmanship. What he didn't anticipate was the quiet transformation, the months of observation, planning, and mental fortitude that had led to this very moment. I had discovered his weakness, understood his strategy, and planned my countermove with precision. I had turned what could have been despair into empowerment.
And as I prepared to step into that dining room, into the eyes of his friends and colleagues, I felt a mixture of nerves and exhilaration. I was about to show the world, and Daniel, that the truth, when wielded with patience and clarity, could topple even the most carefully constructed illusions. I stepped into the restaurant that evening with a steady calm that belied the storm inside me. The chandeliers reflected off the polished floors like tiny stars, mocking the elegance Daniel always wanted to showcase. His friends were gathered, laughing and chatting, the air thick with champagne bubbles and self-assuredness. Daniel's eyes found mine immediately, a mix of surprise and amusement, as if to say, look at my perfect wife right here, ready to pay for the show. I allowed a faint, polite smile, concealing the determination simmering beneath my skin. The dinner unfolded with Daniel making every attempt to shine. He recounted his latest business successes, showing off his knowledge and charm. I listened carefully, nodding at appropriate moments, asking mild, polite questions that drew attention to his words but not to me. Everyone in the room could see the contrast between us, him confident and arrogant, me reserved and quietly attentive. Every smirk, every glance he threw at me, I stored mentally as fuel for the moment I knew would come. Then came the moment the dessert menu had arrived, and Daniel leaned back in his chair sipping wine, ready to make his next joke. "Emily, don't forget our little agreement," he said with that smirk, the one that always tried to shrink me into a shadow. "You know, that $4,000 check." A hush fell over the table. Some of his friends glanced at me, curious. Others chuckled lightly, assuming I would pay quietly, as usual. I reached into my purse, pulling out my phone, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to pause. Then I calmly tapped a few keys and projected the evidence onto the restaurant's small screen. Bank transfers, emails, invoices, all laid bare, meticulously organized, undeniable. The laughter stopped mid-chuckle, the air thickened, and Daniel's smirk faltered as the reality of exposure hit him like a tidal wave. I had expected surprise. What I hadn't expected was the visceral satisfaction of watching him suddenly become small in front of everyone he valued. Gasps filled the room, heads turned, voices whispered questions, and Daniel's friends leaned in, scrutinizing the documents with widening eyes. This can't be right," one colleague murmured, his voice laced with disbelief. Daniel's face went pale, his confident facade cracking with every second. "Emily, wait, you don't understand," he stammered, but no one listened anymore. The power had shifted, and the room knew it. I spoke then, my voice calm but firm. "I understand perfectly, Daniel. This is everything you've been hiding. Every penny you siphoned, every lie you told to impress these friends. It's all here." I let a pause linger, letting the silence sink in like a heavy curtain falling. I could see his mind racing, trying to think of excuses, trying to regain control, but the evidence left no room for manipulation. His empire, built on deceit and arrogance, was crumbling in front of everyone. Daniel's friends exchanged glances, some in shock, others in anger. A few murmured incredulously about ethics and integrity, while others questioned how they had been fooled for so long. The $4,000 bill, which had been meant to humiliate me, now seemed trivial compared to the financial misconduct unfolding before their eyes. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, the bravado he relied upon evaporating in real time. I felt a strange calm wash over me as I watched him unraveling. It wasn't vengeance that drove me, it was justice, clarity, and reclaiming dignity that had been stolen over years of subtle manipulation. I didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse with unnecessary cruelty. I let the facts speak, and they spoke louder than any words I could have used. Daniel's carefully crafted persona, polished over years, could not withstand the weight of truth. I noticed one of his closest friends lean forward, eyebrows furrowed, whispering questions I knew Daniel would struggle to answer. Others nodded in quiet agreement, recognizing the pattern of deception. I felt no gloating pleasure, only a deep sense of relief. The humiliation he tried to cast on me had flipped entirely. His lies, arrogance, and greed were now fully visible, and I remained upright, composed, unbroken. When Daniel finally spoke, it was a fragile attempt at explanation, a scramble of words that fell flat. I shook my head slightly, letting the silence reinforce the point. There was no apology, no plea that could undo what had been revealed. The room collectively understood that the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Daniel was no longer in control. The narrative now belonged to me. I stood, smoothing my dress, and offered a polite nod to the waiter. "Thank you," I said softly, almost as if nothing had happened, while Daniel's gaze followed me with disbelief. I picked up my purse, letting the movement feel natural, unhurried. Every step toward the exit was a testament to the patience and planning that had brought me here. Each footfall resonated with the silent acknowledgement that I had reclaimed control, dignity, and a sense of self-respect that had been threatened. Outside, the night air felt cool against my skin, a contrast to the tension inside the restaurant. I breathed deeply, letting the calmness settle over me. The city lights reflected in puddles on the pavement, shimmering like the first time I had felt truly empowered. Daniel remained behind, facing the immediate fallout, the whispered judgments, the shock of being unmasked in front of the very people he wanted to impress. I walked slowly, savoring the clarity of my victory not in cruelty but in truth. The bill, once a tool of humiliation, had become inconsequential compared to the exposure of his deceit. Every detail, every plan, every moment of patience had led to this. I felt proud not just for the public reveal, but for maintaining composure, integrity, and calm in the face of orchestrated humiliation. I called a cab, watching as the restaurant faded behind me, imagining the discussions and whispers that would follow. Daniel had built a castle of perception, but truth, meticulous preparation, and courage had dismantled it in minutes. I realized that strength isn't about aggression or loud confrontation, it's about strategy, patience, and knowing when to act. As the cab carried me away, I thought about the months of quiet observation, the careful collection of evidence, and the rehearsed moments that had prepared me for this exact scenario. It was a lesson in patience, a reminder that dignity could not be taken, only surrendered if we allowed it. That night, I reclaimed mine fully, leaving Daniel to face the consequences of the empire he had built on lies, and in that moment, I felt a profound sense of freedom. I wasn't just walking away from the restaurant, I was stepping away from the fear, the humiliation, and the years of quiet doubt he had instilled in me. I had proven first to myself that integrity and patience can topple arrogance and deceit, and that truth has a way of shining through, even in the most polished settings. The cab drove me through quiet streets, past glowing windows of lives unaware of the drama that had unfolded, and I allowed myself a smile. It was gentle, unforced, a simple recognition of my resilience. That night, I learned that dignity is not about avoiding shame, but about standing tall through it. I had turned a moment meant to crush me into a triumph that would remain with me for the rest of my life. Moral lesson: life often places us in situations meant to humiliate or test our dignity. It's okay to feel fear, embarrassment, or anger. These are human emotions, but strength lies in patience, preparation, and quiet resilience. By observing carefully, acting strategically, and trusting our inner judgment, we can transform moments of shame into victories of integrity. Remember, it's not about seeking revenge, but reclaiming control and dignity with calm and clarity. Every setback can teach us, every betrayal can sharpen our instincts, and every act of courage, even quietly executed, has the power to reshape the narrative of our lives.